What if I told you back in the day, governments could, like, hire private companies to be their navy?
Well, it sounds crazy, but
Yeah.
it really happened. We're diving into the world of privateers today. These were basically buccaneers.
Okay, Buccaneers, I'm intrigued. So how did that work? These private citizens were just allowed to attack other ships.
Well, they had something called a letter of marque.
A letter of what?
A letter of marque. It was like a permission slip from the government. It let them attack and capture enemy ships during wartime.
So it was legal piracy.
It was definitely a way for private citizens to get rich quick, but it wasn't a free-for-all. These letters of marque, they had all these rules and regulations. Oh, yeah. Like, they specified which ships the privateer could target, what they could do, even how long they could operate.
So what you're saying is the government was basically like, here's a license, go cause some chaos, but follow the rule book.
Pretty much.
That's wild. But why go through all that trouble? Why not just use their own navies?
Ugh, good question. You see, for smaller nations or those without a big navy, it was a cheap way to boost their sea power. Like, they didn't have to pay for a huge fleet.
So a budget navy.
Yeah, you could say that. But you can imagine, a system like this, it was wide open to abuse.
Oh, I bet. It's like giving someone a license to steal and saying, just don't get caught.
Well, the line between privateering and straight-up piracy, it got very blurry.
I can imagine. A ship full of treasure, no witnesses. Tempting.
Very tempting. And life on the high seas, it was already dangerous. Add in battles, storms, diseases.
Talk about a high-risk, high-reward lifestyle.
Exactly. And as if that weren't enough, things got even more complicated the further you moved away from European waters.
Oh, how so?
Well, you have to remember, European powers, they were expanding their reach all over the globe, right?
Right.
You're running into different cultures, different ways of governing. What they considered privateering might be seen as just piracy to someone else.
So a matter of perspective.
Exactly. Like in the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean, those areas were a melting pot of different powers. It wasn't always clear whose rules were the right ones.
Whose law of the land, or I guess law of the sea, applied.
Exactly. That's what makes this whole thing so interesting. It's all about the blurred lines between legal warfare, getting rich, and being a pirate.
It's like a historical gray area.
Totally. And speaking of gray areas, what happened if a privateer overstepped their bounds? Like, what if their letter of marque expired at the worst possible moment?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
What did happen? Did they just become a pirate?
Well, they could be accused of piracy, yeah.
Makes sense.
And there's actually a very famous example of this, a name you might recognize, Captain William Kidd.
Captain Kidd. Wait, as in the infamous pirate Captain Kidd.
The one and only?
You're telling me he started out as a privateer?
He did.
Wow. I did not see that coming. Okay, I need more details. How does a respected privateer become a wanted pirate?
Well, it's a classic story of how quickly things could change in the privateering world.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Kidd was commissioned to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean. He even had a letter of marque and everything.
So far, so good, right?
Right. But then he was accused of piracy after he took some ships that belonged to Mughal India, a very powerful empire back then.
I see where this is going.
Yeah, whether those seizures were actually legal or not, it's still debated today.
Did he follow the letter of the law, or did he get greedy?
That's the question. But to make matters worse, when Kidd went back to deal with these accusations, he couldn't find the paperwork to prove he was in the right.
Oh no, paperwork strikes again.
And he ended up being hanged for piracy in 1701.
Talk about a fall from grace.
Yeah.
So even with that official backing, it wasn't a guaranteed get-out-of-jail-free card. Those letters of marque, they were important.
Absolutely vital. This just shows how risky being a privateer really was. One minute you're a respected captain, the next you're swinging from the gallows.
High stakes indeed. So it wasn't all about the promise of gold and glory. What motivated these guys to take on such a dangerous job?
Well, the money was a big motivator, you're right. But many of them were also skilled sailors. They loved the adventure, the challenge of the open sea.
So a mix of get rich quick and I love a good adrenaline rush.
Something like that. And these voyages, they could last for months, even years. The things those crews must have seen, the bonds they must have formed.
Sounds intense. But I imagine it wasn't all sunshine and pirate treasure. I mean, what were some of the downsides of being a privateer?
Well, just imagine the conditions. Relentless sun, terrifying storms, rough seas.
Okay. Yeah, not exactly a relaxing day at the beach.
Not at all. Plus, diseases ran rampant on ships back then. Dysentery. You mentioned scurvy before.
Ah, scurvy, the bane of every sailor's existence.
And on top of all that, there's the constant threat of running into enemy ships or even other pirates looking for an easy target.
Yikes.
They were basically living in a war zone where anything could happen.
Risking it all for a chance at fortune.
Exactly. And let's not forget, they were trying to do all of this while staying on the right side of the law, which wasn't always so clear-cut.
Right, that whole legal piracy thing.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, were these guys more like skilled mercenaries? Or were they driven by something more like patriotism and duty?
It's a great question, and honestly, the answer probably depends on the person. Some were probably in it for the love of their country, others just wanted to line their pockets.
One man's pirate is another man's privateer, as they say.
Really?
Speech to privateers. We can't have this discussion without talking about some of the most legendary figures.
Absolutely. They were more than just pirates. These guys shaped history, they went on daring raids, came up with cunning strategies, amassed crazy wealth.
They were like the rock stars of the sea. Okay, so who are some of the most famous privateers? Whose stories do we need to know?
Well, one name that immediately comes to mind is Sir Francis Drake.
Drake, as in Drake's Passage, that really rough patch of water down by South America.
That's the one. Drake was a legend. Queen Elizabeth I knighted him for his exploits against the Spanish. He sailed around the world, plundered their treasure ships. He even helped defeat the Spanish Armada.
Yeah, that's what I call an impressive resume. He wasn't messing around. Who else should be on our list of legendary privateers?
Let's see. Oh, there's Jean Lafitte. He was active in the Gulf of Mexico in the early 1800s.
Lafitte. Okay.
Tell me more.
He and his brother, they set up this whole network of smuggling and privateering bases all along the Gulf Coast.
Smuggling and privateering sounds like quite the operation.
It was. And you know what's really interesting? He actually ended up having a run-in with the U.S. government.
Oh, no way. Okay, I need to hear this story. What happened?
We might need a whole other deep dive to cover all that, but what's important to remember is this. Privateers like Drake and Lafitte, they weren't just lone wolves out there. That's true. They had to have a crew. They had to have a ship. They needed a lot of people to pull off those daring heists on the high seas. Speaking of ships, what kind of vessels did these privateers use? Was it all tattered sails and skull and crossbones flags?
Not exactly. They had all sorts of ships, from small, speedy ones perfect for outrunning bigger ships to heavily armed warships ready for a real fight.
So from sneaky and fast to come and get some.
Pretty much. A privateer ship, it really showed you their strategy, their goals.
Well, that makes sense. And their reach, it wasn't limited to just one little part of the world. These guys were going global. What kind of impact did that have, having these privateers crisscrossing the oceans?
Well, their actions had a real effect on world trade, on naval warfare, even on which countries had the most power. This was especially true during the 17th and 18th centuries. We call it the golden age of privateering.
The golden age, really.
Yeah.
What made that period so great for privateers?
Well, just picture it, almost constant warfare. During those centuries, Europe was full of wars over resources, trade routes, who got what colonies. It was perfect for ambitious privateers.
So more wars meant more opportunities for privateers to do their thing.
Exactly. And all that maritime trade, it exploded during that time. Those ships were full of valuable goods. Easy pickings.
A privateer's dream come true.
And it wasn't just about getting rich. Privateers could really mess up an enemy's economy, like the English privateers who targeted Spanish ships carrying gold. A few good raids, and Spain couldn't fund their wars.
Wow, so these privateers had real influence.
They did. But eventually, even golden ages end, right?
Right.
Yeah.
What happened? Did the privateering bubble burst?
Well, a few things caused their decline in the 1800s. The Industrial Revolution, for one, it led to faster, stronger warships. Those little ships privateers liked couldn't compete with those new steam-powered boats.
Technology marches on.
It does. And governments started making their own stronger navies. They didn't really need privateers anymore.
Privateers got pushed out.
In a way. But the final blow came in 1856, the Declaration of Paris that outlawed privateering for good.
The end of an era.
It was. The U.S. didn't sign it right away, but they haven't given out a letter of marque since the Civil War.
It makes you wonder, do we have anything like privateers today?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. We don't have those ship battles anymore, but people are still searching for wealth, for power, and they often bend the rules to get it.
That's true. It's a different kind of sea, but the same game. What about computer hackers? Some people see them as modern-day privateers.
Now, that's an interesting comparison. Think about it. Hackers operate in a world with its own rules, kind of like how those privateers did, right?
Right.
They exploit weaknesses like security flaws online, and their goal is often to cause disruption, take what they can, and make money.
Wow. When you put it that way, I totally see the similarities. Hackers in hoodies, privateers with eye patches, different methods, same goals.
Exactly. It goes to show some things never really change.
Human nature stays the same. Well, this has been an amazing deep dive. I never knew there was so much to learn about privateers.
It's a fascinating part of history.
It really is. Until next time, thanks for joining us for this exploration of all things privateering.
He did, yeah. He started with a real letter of marque, official orders to go after pirates in the Indian Ocean.
Wow, from pirate hunter to pirate. It's kind of ironic.
It really is, and it shows how easily things could change for these privateers. One minute you're in the clear, the next you're public enemy number one.
So what happened with Kidd? Did he just go rogue?
Well, he was accused of piracy after he captured ships belonging to Mughal India. It was a powerful empire back then.
Okay, and? Was that allowed?
That's the thing. It's still debated today whether those captures were actually legal or not.
Sounds like a gray area. So was he following the rules, or did he get blinded by all that treasure?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But to make matters worse, when Kidd returned to face the music, he couldn't produce the paperwork to prove he was in the right.
The paperwork? Of course.
It was his downfall. Kidd was hanged for piracy in 1701.
All because he couldn't find his receipts? What a story. I guess it shows that even with a letter of marque, a privateer was never completely safe.
Absolutely. It was a risky business, no doubt about it.
It makes you wonder, what drove these people to become privateers? Was it all about the money, the adventure? What do you think?
Well, the potential for riches was definitely a huge draw, no doubt. But for many of these men, it was more than just that. These were skilled sailors. They thrived on the challenges of life at sea.
It's that mix, right? Chasing fortune and adventure.
Exactly. And think about it. These voyages could last for months, even years at a time. Imagine the things they saw, the bonds they formed with their crewmates.
I can only imagine. It must have been an incredible experience in a lot of ways. But it definitely wasn't all glamorous treasure hunts and epic battles. What about the downsides? What were some of the harsh realities these privateers faced?
Oh, plenty. I mean, just the day-to-day reality of being on a ship back then was tough. Sun, storms, rough seas.
Right, not exactly a pleasure cruise.
Not even close. Plus, diseases were a constant threat on those ships. We talked about scurvy, but there was also dysentery and all sorts of other nasty illnesses.
It sounds pretty awful, honestly.
It was dangerous, that's for sure. And of course, there was always the risk of running into enemy ships or even other pirates looking for an easy target.
Yikes. So it was like living in a war zone, but on the water.
Exactly. They were risking their lives every single day, all for a chance at fortune and maybe a little bit of glory.
And trying to stay on the right side of the law, which wasn't always easy.
That's the thing about privateers. They walked a very fine line between being a legitimate sailor and a criminal.
It's a blurry line, for sure. So how do we make sense of these privateers? Were they more like skilled mercenaries, hired guns for the government? Or were they driven by something more, like patriotism, a sense of duty to their nation?
That's a really interesting question. And honestly, I think the answer is it depends. Every privateer had their own motivations. Some were probably in it for the money and the adventure, while others might have been driven by a genuine desire to serve their country.
Different ships, different motivations, but all sailing under that same letter of marque. Well, we can't talk about privateers without mentioning some of the most legendary figures in history, right? These were the guys who really made a name for themselves on the high seas.
Oh, absolutely. They were more than just pirates. These guys shaped history. They went on daring raids, came up with cunning strategies, amassed crazy wealth.
Legends of the sea. So, who are some of the most famous privateers? Whose stories should we know?
Well, one name that immediately comes to mind is Sir Francis Drake.
Drake, as in Drake's Passage, that treacherous waterway down by South America.
That's the one. Drake was a legend in his own time. Queen Elizabeth I even knighted him for his exploits against the Spanish.
That's a pretty big honor.
It was. He sailed around the world, captured Spanish treasure ships, even played a key role in defeating the Spanish Armada.
Wow. Talk about a life less ordinary. Okay, so Drake's on the list. Who else? Give me another legendary privateer.
All right, how about Jean Lafitte? He was a privateer who operated in the Gulf of Mexico in the early 19th century.
Lafitte. Okay, I've heard the name, but I don't know much about him. Tell me more.
Well, he and his brother, they built up this whole network of smuggling and privateering bases along the Gulf Coast. They were quite the pair.
Smuggling and privateering sounds like a risky business, even for a privateer.
It was. And you know what's interesting? Lafitte actually had a run-in with the U.S. government.
Oh no, did he? What happened?
We might need another deep dive to cover that whole story, but it's important to remember that guys like Drake and Lafitte, they weren't just lone wolves out there on the open sea. They needed a crew, a ship, and a whole network of support to pull off their daring exploits.
Right. It takes a village to plunder a Spanish galleon, I guess.
Something like that. And speaking of ships, they weren't all just those classic pirate ships with tattered sails and Jolly Rogers flying high. Privateers used all sorts of ships, depending on their strategy and goals.
So what kind of ships did they use? Spill the details.
Well, some preferred smaller, faster vessels, perfect for outrunning those big, lumbering ships. They were all about speed and maneuverability.
So, like the sports cars of the sea, what about those who wanted to go head-to-head with the big boys?
Oh, they would use larger, heavily armed warships. Those were the privateers who were ready for a real fight, the ones who weren't afraid to take on anyone.
Wow, so they had a ship for every occasion, from stealthy raiders to heavy hitters. It makes you realize these privateers, they weren't just confined to one little corner of the world. They were making waves all over the globe, from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. What kind of impact did that have, having these privateers crisscrossing the ocean?
Well, they had a real impact, I'll tell you. Their actions affected global trade, naval warfare, even which countries had the most power. It was especially wild during the 17th and 18th centuries, the golden age of privateering.
The Golden Age, huh? What made that period so special for these privateers? Why was it booming then?
It was a time of almost constant war in Europe. They were fighting over everything: resources, trade routes, who got which colonies. Perfect for a privateer looking to make a fortune.
So the privateers, they were like taking advantage of all the chaos.
You could say that. Plus, maritime trade was booming. Those ships were loaded with valuable cargo. It was like a giant buffet for these guys.
A buffet with cannons and pirates. So more wars, more trade, more opportunities for privateers to get rich.
Exactly. And their impact, it went beyond just individual gain. A successful privateer could really hurt a nation's economy. They could even tip the scales in a war.
Wow, so they had real power.
They did. Like, think about the English privateers who went after those Spanish treasure fleets. A couple of successful raids, and Spain's war chest was empty.
That's incredible. Talk about a high-stakes game. But all good things must come to an end, right? What happened? Did governments finally realize that unleashing these, well, legal pirates wasn't the best look?
Well, the decline of privateering in the 19th century, it was a combination of things. For one, the Industrial Revolution changed everything. Bigger, faster, stronger warships came along. Those nimble little ships the privateers loved, outmatched.
Technology changes the game.
Always does. And then governments, they started to build up their own navies. Big, powerful ones. They didn't really need privateers anymore.
So privateering just kind of faded out.
In a way, but there was a more official end. 1856, the Declaration of Paris. That outlawed privateering for good.
The end of an era. No more letters of marque.
Not officially. The U.S., they didn't sign it right away, but they haven't issued a letter of marque since the Civil War.
Wow. History's so interesting. It makes you wonder, though, do we have anything like privateers today?
It's an interesting question to consider. We don't have ships battling it out for gold anymore, but the pursuit of wealth and power, that never really goes away, does it?
It doesn't. People are always going to try and find the loopholes, push the boundaries. It's human nature, I guess. What about computer hackers? Do you think they're like the modern-day privateers?
That's a fascinating comparison. Think about it. They operate in this world with its own rules, its own code of conduct. Kind of like those privateers, right?
They're kind of like digital pirates, aren't they?
You could say that. They're looking for weaknesses, security flaws, anything they can exploit. They often want to cause chaos, steal information, make a profit.
It's crazy how some things never really change. Different tools, different battlefields, but the same motivations. Privateers, hackers, it's all connected in a way.
It really is. And it just goes to show sometimes to understand the present, we have to look to the past.
Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of privateers. Who knew there was so much to learn about these legal pirates?
It's a side of history many people don't know about.
It's full of adventure, intrigue, and a whole lot of gray areas. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey through maritime history. Until next time.